2 million years ago, if you fell asleep on the African savanna, you were not the biggest thing that noticed, and not the fastest either. Lions bigger than today's, hyenas that hunted in packs. Somewhere in the dark, a saber-toothed cat with canines the length of a human hand, testing the wind for your fire or the absence of one. Our ancestors had no claws, no fangs, no speed worth mentioning. By almost every physical measure, they should have been a mid-tier snack. Instead, that same fragile animal became the most dominant predator the planet has ever produced. The question isn't whether they were vulnerable, they were. It's how something this poorly equipped for violence made it to the top of the food chain anyway. Let's be specific about what dangerous meant during this period, because the modern version of Africa's wildlife is a watered-down preview of what existed during most of human evolution. Alongside lions, leopards, and hyenas, the landscape included saber-toothed cats, giant hunting hyenas considerably larger than the ones alive today, and even oversized baboons capable of taking on a lone human. This wasn't a world with one or two apex predators to avoid. It was a world layered with them, each occupying a slightly different niche, each perfectly capable of killing a human who made the wrong decision at the wrong moment. And this isn't speculation built on guesswork. Archaeologists have found actual physical evidence of this violence written directly onto ancient bone. Fossilized human remains bearing tooth marks and puncture wounds, consistent with big cats and hyenas, have turned up at multiple sites, including a human femur recovered from a Moroccan cave that had clearly served as a carnivore den. That bone didn't get there by accident. It got there because something dragged it in, chewed on it, and left it behind the same way it would leave behind the remains of any other meal. For a long time, popular imagination pictured early humans as confident hunters standing at the top of their world from the very beginning. The bone evidence tells a messier story. Our ancestors weren't just predators during this period. They were, with some regularity, prey. And the danger didn't only come from the ground. One of the most famous early hominin fossils ever discovered, a roughly 3-year-old Australopithecus africanus known today as the Taung Child, shows puncture marks at the base of both eye sockets that closely match the damage modern crowned eagles leave on the skulls of monkeys they've killed and carried back to a nest. That match isn't a loose comparison. Researchers studying the fossil found the scratch patterns around the eye sockets and the back of the skull were nearly identical to feeding damage documented on primates actively hunted by these eagles today. A child snatched from the ground by something arriving from directly overhead is not a threat any amount of watching the tree line would have prevented. It's a reminder that the list of things trying to kill early humans wasn't limited to what could be seen coming. This matters because it reframes the entire question we're asking in this video. We're not asking how early humans avoided all danger. They didn't. We're asking how a species that was demonstrably being killed and eaten on a regular basis, from the ground and from the air, still managed to expand, multiply, and eventually flip the entire relationship on its head. If there's a single turning point researchers keep coming back to, it's fire. Not fire as a cooking tool first. That part of the story usually gets overstated. The earliest, most consistent advantage fire offered was defensive. Light and heat kept large carnivores at a distance, turning open, exposed ground into something closer to a safe perimeter for the first time in human history. Recent archaeological work has pushed the timeline for fire control back further than researchers expected. Evidence from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa suggests hominins were controlling fire as far back as roughly 1 million years ago, and sites across Africa, Spain, and Israel dating between 800,000 and 1.8 million years old show fire use clustered specifically around locations where large animal carcasses were being processed. That detail is the interesting part. Researchers at Tel Aviv University have proposed that fire's earliest major function wasn't warmth or cooking at all. It was protecting a hard-won kill from being stolen by scavengers and helping preserve meat through smoking, so it didn't spoil before it could be finished. In other words, fire's first job wasn't making dinner. It was guarding dinner from everything else that also wanted it. Then, in late 2025, archaeologists working in Britain uncovered fragments of iron pyrite next to a 400,000-year-old hearth, physical proof that humans weren't just capturing wildfires and keeping embers alive. They were actively striking sparks and making fire on demand. That distinction matters enormously. A group that depends on finding fire is vulnerable every single night that no fire is available. A group that can make fire whenever it needs to has effectively removed one of the biggest advantages nighttime predators had always held over them. Once fire became reliable, it reshaped daily life in ways that went far beyond simple protection. Groups could finally gather after dark without huddling in silence, listening for movement in the grass. That firelit time became space for talking, teaching, and passing down the exact kind of practical survival knowledge this channel keeps coming back to, because a fire that keeps predators away is only useful if the next generation also knows how to build one. Fire also didn't work in isolation. It worked alongside careful decisions about where to actually spend the night, decisions that mattered just as much as the flame itself. Elevated ground, rock overhangs, and cave mouths with a single narrow entrance all offered something a fire alone couldn't, a limit on how many directions danger could approach from. A predator that has to come through one opening, past a burning fire, into a space full of alert adults, is facing a fundamentally different proposition than a predator stalking a group asleep in the open. This is part of why cave sites show up so consistently in the archaeological record of this period, not because early humans were cave dwellers in some permanent romantic sense, but because a defensible sleeping location was a survival tool in exactly the same category as a spear or a fire. Choosing where to sleep was never a passive decision. It was a nightly calculation, repeated for hundreds of thousands of years, weighing water access and shelter from weather against the much more immediate question of what could get to you while you were unconscious and defenseless. Fire explains a lot about the nights. It doesn't explain the days, and most of a hunter-gatherer's dangerous hours happened in daylight, out in the open, away from any hearth. For that, the answer isn't a piece of technology at all. It's something considerably older and, frankly, considerably cheaper: living in groups. Researchers studying primate behavior have long pointed out that group living is one of the most consistent anti-predator strategies in the entire animal kingdom, and it shows up especially strongly among species active during the day, exactly like early humans. A lone individual has one set of eyes and one set of ears. A group of 20 has 40 of each, scanning the tree line, the grass, the ridge line, in every direction at once. Something approaching has to get past all of that awareness before it gets close enough to strike. And if it does get close, a group doesn't just detect danger better than a lone individual. It can actually respond to it collectively through mobbing behavior, throwing rocks, shouting, closing ranks, or simply scattering in enough directions to confuse a predator that had locked onto a single target. There's a practical structure hiding underneath this too. One that's easy to miss if you only think about group living as a vague safety in numbers idea. Larger coordinated groups could actually divide the labor of staying alive. Some members could forage or process food, while others watched the surrounding terrain. A division of attention that a solitary individual simply doesn't have the luxury of. Children and anyone injured or otherwise vulnerable could be kept toward the center of a group rather than exposed at its edges. None of this required language as sophisticated as ours, or any formal planning in the way we'd recognize it today. It likely emerged the same way most of the strategies in this video did, through trial and error, with groups that instinctively organized this way, surviving more encounters than groups that didn't, and passing that tendency forward. This is also where things get genuinely interesting from a hunting angle, not just a defensive one. The same coordination that kept a group safe from lions could be turned around and used against other animals entirely. Ethnographic research on the Hadza, a hunter-gatherer community in Tanzania, who still live a lifestyle that overlaps meaningfully with ancient practices, shows something that sounds almost contradictory. The Hadza don't just hunt game. They regularly chase lions off their own kills and successfully fend off attacks from leopards using coordinated group pressure rather than raw individual strength. That single fact tells you something important about how this entire survival strategy actually worked. It was never really about becoming individually tougher than a lion. It was about making sure a lion was never facing one human. It was facing a group. Numbers and fire bought early humans distance from danger. Tools closed the gap on their own terms, letting them fight and hunt on their own schedule instead of waiting to be ambushed. The clearest physical proof of this comes from a coal mine in Schöningen, Germany, where archaeologists uncovered a set of remarkably well-preserved wooden spears. Originally estimated at around 400,000 years old and more recently reassessed at closer to 300,000 to 200,000 years old, depending on the dating method used. These weren't crude sharpened sticks. Researchers have identified distinct designs among the Schöningen finds: heavier thrusting spears for close range use, lighter throwing spears meant to be launched at a distance, and even double-pointed throwing sticks likely used on smaller, faster game-like deer. That range of specialized designs tells you this wasn't a single lucky discovery. It was an established, refined toolkit built by people who understood exactly which weapon suited which kind of danger. And that distinction between thrusting and throwing matters more than it might sound. A thrusting spear still requires getting close enough to a large, dangerous animal to stab it directly, which is a genuinely risky proposition against something that outweighs you by half a ton. A throwing weapon changes the entire risk calculation. It lets a hunter or a group of hunters strike from a distance a predator can't immediately close, converting a face-to-face confrontation into something closer to a coordinated ambush. Researchers examining the lighter Schöningen throwing sticks have even suggested they may have been light enough for less experienced hunters, possibly including children learning the skill, to participate in group hunts. That's a detail worth sitting with. This wasn't just weapon technology, it was a training system, embedded directly into the tools themselves, quietly ensuring the next generation grew up already knowing how to use them. Put fire, group coordination, and thrown weapons together, and something fundamental starts to shift. Early humans weren't just surviving encounters with dangerous animals anymore. They were starting to control when those encounters happened in the first place. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange. Because the transition from occasional meal to top of the food chain wasn't smooth, and it wasn't quick. Some of the clearest archaeological evidence of frequent meat consumption among early Homo dates back roughly 1.85 million years, and researchers studying this period have made an interesting observation about food webs in general. Apex predators like lions typically aren't killed and eaten by other predators. Hyenas don't regularly prey on lions. So if early Homo habilis was successfully acquiring large carcasses on a consistent basis, whether by hunting directly or aggressively driving lions off their own kills, that alone suggests these early humans were already managing predation risk well enough to compete near the top, even while remaining physically unimpressive by any conventional measure. But competing near the top is not the same as being safe. That Moroccan cave bone we mentioned earlier is a reminder that this transition wasn't linear. For an enormous stretch of prehistory, humans were simultaneously predator and prey, sometimes within the same week, sometimes within the same day, chasing a wounded animal in the morning, then retreating to a defensible sleeping spot that night, specifically because something bigger might come looking. Scholars studying this era have spent decades arguing over exactly how this balance actually worked. Some early researchers imagined our ancestors as ruthless killer apes with nothing to fear. Others argued the opposite, that early humans were fundamentally weak, vulnerable prey animals who simply got lucky. The evidence that's accumulated since suggests neither extreme is right. Early humans appear to have been something messier and honestly more impressive than either story. A species that spent an enormous span of its history being actively hunted and used exactly that pressure, group vigilance, fire, coordinated defense, thrown weapons, to gradually, unevenly, and without any single dramatic turning point, climb its way into the predator role instead. The fact that we can even find gnawed human bones at all tells you something important on its own. It tells you the transition to apex predator wasn't handed to our species. It was earned the hard way, through generations of individuals who didn't survive the encounters that didn't go their way, while the strategies of the ones who did survive got passed down, refined, and repeated until eventually they simply outweighed the failures. It's also worth noting how directly this connects back to the tools and coordination we just covered, because the food web logic researchers rely on here isn't abstract. In African savanna ecosystems today, apex predators like lions essentially don't die from other predator attacks, precisely because nothing else is positioned to challenge them. Hunter-gatherer communities like the Hadza occupy that same protected tier now, not because they've grown claws or fangs in the intervening millennia, but because fire, weapons, and group coordination collectively function as the equivalent of claws and fangs. That's worth sitting with for a second. The tools we've been describing throughout this video weren't separate from the biology of predation. They effectively became early humans' biology, external adaptations doing the job that fur, size, and natural weaponry do for every other animal on that list of apex predators. A species didn't need to evolve armor when it could build a fire circle instead. So what does an honest look at 2 million years of near-constant predator pressure actually tell us about what humans are underneath everything else? A few things worth sitting with. First, nearly every effective survival strategy we've covered in this video was a group strategy, not an individual one. Fire only works as protection if someone tends it and others trust it'll still be burning at 3 in the morning. Mobbing a predator only works if enough individuals commit to acting together instead of scattering. Even the Schöningen throwing sticks appear to have been designed with group participation, including less experienced hunters built directly into the concept. Humans didn't outmuscle, outrun, or outclaw the predators around them. We out-cooperated them consistently across an almost incomprehensible span of time, and that cooperative instinct didn't stay behind on the savanna. It's arguably still the single most defining trait separating human behavior from nearly everything else in the animal kingdom. Second, vulnerability and dominance turned out not to be opposites. They were stages of the exact same process. Every advantage that eventually made humans dangerous, fire, thrown weapons, coordinated group tactics, was developed specifically because humans started out catastrophically outmatched. If our ancestors had been born with claws, fangs, and genuine speed, there's a real argument that none of these tools would have needed to exist at all. The predators that hunted our ancestors didn't just threaten the species. In a strange, indirect way, they built it. And third, This wasn't fast and it wasn't guaranteed. Nothing about this outcome was inevitable. It happened through an enormous number of individual moments spread across an almost unimaginable timescale. A group that built a fire and survived the night, a hunter who threw instead of stabbed and lived to refine the technique, a community that held formation instead of scattering when something large moved in the grass. None of it was one dramatic breakthrough. It was accumulated behavior tested against real consequences generation after generation until the balance of power on the African savanna had quietly, gradually, and almost imperceptibly flipped. So how did ancient humans actually survive a world stacked with animals built specifically to kill them? Not through strength and not through speed, because on both counts, they were consistently outmatched. They survived through fire that turned darkness from a threat into a controlled space, through group vigilance that multiplied the eyes and ears watching for danger far beyond what any individual could manage alone, through weapons that let them strike from a distance instead of waiting to be struck first, and through an almost stubborn willingness to keep refining every one of those strategies across generations, even while the bone record makes clear that plenty of individual attempts ended in failure. Maybe the most genuinely striking part of this entire story is what it says about where real dominance actually comes from. Ancient humans didn't become the most dangerous species on the planet by being the toughest animal in the room. They became dangerous by being the animal most willing to work together, adapt, and pass hard-earned knowledge forward, generation after generation, until a species that once left gnaw marks on cave floors eventually became the reason nearly every other predator on Earth learned to keep its distance.